So I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's conversation with the critics, hosted by New York Academy of Art. I guess you could say hosted by me and presented by New York Academy of Art, but that's just kind of getting into semantics. My name is Dexter Wemberly. I'm a senior critic at New York Academy of Art, and I'm excited about today's conversation. I'm joined by three fantastic writers, journalists, critics. Jori Finkel is a journalist who covers art from the West Coast for New York Times and the Art newspaper. Her writing has also been published in W Magazine, Art in America, ARTnews, and Art+Auction magazine, where she was previously a senior editor in New York. She lectures regularly at museums and art fairs and also appears on NPR, PBS, and CNN broadcasts as part of their larger project of making contemporary art more accessible. In 2018, she developed and co-produced KCET, the Emmy-nominated documentary Artist and Mother. Her book, It Speaks to Me, Art That Inspires Artists by Prestel, was called Fascinating by Publishers Weekly, and An Argument for Why Art Museums Matter by New York Magazine. So Jori, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Sebastian, thank you so much. Sebastian Smee is an art critic for the Washington Post and the author of The Art of Rivalry: 4 Friendships, Betrayals, and Breakthroughs in Modern Art. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2011 while at the Boston Globe and teaches nonfiction writing at Wesley College. He has written books on Lucian Freud and Mark Bradford and is currently writing a book about the Berthe Morisot and Edouard Manet during the Siege of Paris and the Paris Commune, 1870 to 71. I want to welcome you, Sebastian, as well.
Thank you.
Siddhartha Mitter writes about art, creative communities, and their social context. His writing includes artist profiles, scene stories, and reported essays and criticism. His stories have engaged particularly with art and culture work in the urban United States, in the American South, and in multiple locations in Africa, from where he was reporting frequently prior to the pandemic. Currently, Siddhartha writes mostly for the New York Times. He has also contributed recently to W Magazine, National Geographic, and others. He was a regular contributor to The Village Voice prior to its closure in 2018. Previously, he wrote for the Boston Globe on music and was a culture reporter at WNYC New York Public Radio from 2006 to 2009. Siddhartha also contributed to Art Forum, Art in America, and others. Welcome, Siddhartha, as well.
Thank you.
So, there was an interesting question before we got started, and Jori was like, well, how long have we been doing this? And we've been doing this a very long time. I think that New York Academy of Art recognizes that in addition to hearing from artists and curators and people who run galleries, there's a lot to be gained by talking to people who write about art. And in fact, to me, it's one of the more fascinating aspects of this art, I guess, constellation or ecosystem or whatever you want to call it. So although I've read your bios, and I'm sure I did a terrible job at it, but although I read your bios, I'd love to give each of you just a moment to introduce yourself in the way you would, because I imagine if I met you at a cocktail party, looking forward to the next cocktail party, you wouldn't you wouldn't read your bio to me. So so let's start with you, Jori. If I ran into you and I said, hey, what do you do? Who are you? How do you talk about the work that you do in the arts?
Yeah, well, one of the things is that I've been in LA for 15 years now, which feels like a long time. We've seen a lot of changes in LA over that time. So I'm a journalist in the art world. I do reported stories as opposed to reviews. I started out doing both, but I went more in the direction of journalism for a number of reasons. We can talk about those later. And yeah, I came to LA at a time when people did not believe there was anything worth covering in Los Angeles. And everyone in New York who I knew asked me, why are you going to LA? Who are you following? What boyfriend are you following to LA? And the answer was nobody. And there are a lot of artists here. And, I've been trying to prove them wrong or show them what they've been missing ever since. So I've been here for 15 years covering art for national and international publications.
No, that's fantastic. It's funny. I remember, I don't want to date myself too much, but I remember all of these different sort of like moments in time when LA became the thing that everyone in the art world was talking about. It's like, you're opening a gallery in LA? You're moving to LA? What's going on in LA? And it seems so crazy now because LA, it was already on the map, but LA is such a part of the art world, has been for forever. New York's funny that way. I'm a native New Yorker, and I know New York's biases when it comes to other places. So anyway, we'll get into that later too.
Sure.
So Siddhartha, I'd ask you the same. How do you talk about the work that you do?
I'm a lot like Jori. I think of myself more as a journalist or a writer, certainly not as a critic, although I can do that, and I do that to a certain degree. It does seem that more than anything, I do reported stories, but then of course it can be argued that the difference between the two categories isn't as great as it is theorized to be, or that certainly I think in our field is so impoverished and immiserated, and there are so few of us doing this work in visible places with good editors and at industry standard, that we are being critical in our choice of topics, in our approach. I think any reported piece that we do contains a criticality, and that's a criticality that we can embrace and that we can work within and take advantage of. In terms of what's not in the bio, I mean, I think people might find it interesting that I came to all of this late. I was in middle age when I came to working primarily and deeply on contemporary visual art, though I had done culture journalism across fields for some time. I was in middle age when I came to journalism. I was in early middle age when I came to journalism. I did other things before that. My training is not only is it not in the arts, it's also not in journalism. And I was already into middle age when I moved to New York. So I am in New York now. I write primarily for the Times at the moment. I used to write for the Village Voice in its sort of swan song years. I used to be at WNYC Radio. So I've been in the New York, whatever, writing arts media world for quite a long time now. But I showed up when most people were already fully formed in that game of my generation. And so I can hope that maybe the newness, which is no longer such a newness now, but still the relative newness in all of these domains, forced me to be, allowed me to be inquisitive and not take anything for granted, and also not be sort of impressed by whatever New York bullshit it might be. But it also forced me to work hard. I had to research in order to be good at what I do, in terms of topic, in terms of method, in terms of profession, and in terms of industry milieu. And I still do. And actually, the main reason why I like doing this work is that we get the chance to learn something every single time.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's interesting. I mean, you're talking about like coming to things in middle age, and we'll come back to that too, because I'm not, like what middle age is seems to keep changing. I'm not quite sure. I'm sure there's a firm definition.
I'm in it. I'm definitely in it. Yeah, by any measure. Yeah.
Also, your connection to Village Voice kind of makes me just want to take a moment to recognize Greg Tate, who we recently lost. A fantastic writer who I, was fortunate enough to meet and befriend over the years in New York City. And so anyone who doesn't know Greg Tate's writing, I recommend you just go on a deep dive on the internet, find some articles and read Greg Tate's work. So Sebastian, same question for you. How do you go about yourself?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. I mean, about Greg Tate, first of all, I mean, he really is just fantastic and such a loss. He wrote a catalog essay for a show here in Boston, where I live, actually, even though I'm at the Post, I live in Boston. About, it was about Jean-Michel Basquiat and hip hop, and I didn't really know much about his writing. I'd read a profile about him and so on before that, but I've just devoured all his writing since then. He's just so amazing. So and Siddhartha, to your point as well about learning on the job, it's just so true. I think that's one of the most wonderful things about being an art writer at the moment. There's just so much going on in so many different fields. I often think of something Peter Sheldal said about, he said, there's nothing I know that I didn't learn on deadline. And I often feel like that, right? It's just, you're just always taking stuff in and then you're moving on to something completely different. I'm Australian. You can probably hear from my accent. I grew up in Australia. I started writing a sort of column about commercial gallery shows when I was 23 for the Sydney Morning Herald. I moved to the UK, lived there between 2000 and 2004, and actually worked for the Art newspaper, which is, such a great publication. And I learned so much on that. But also worked for other broadsheet newspapers in London. And then went back to Australia, worked for a few years there, just 3 or 4 years before getting a job at the Boston Globe. So I've sort of been back and forth. And I'm mostly a critic, so I review exhibitions, but there's so much pressure on us, and this is a pressure I welcome because it sort of expands my range and keeps life interesting, but pressure to write other kinds of pieces as well. And so, I've just written a piece about NFTs in the art world, after going down to Art Basel Miami Beach, and I might write an oral history of the making of Ragnar Kjartansen's The Visitors, or a news piece about deaccessioning. It can be all sorts of stuff, and that's great. It keeps life interesting. So yeah, that's my story.
Thank you. I know that many of the people joining us today are artists themselves who are curious about the process of getting the attention of writers and how that works. And I know that for each of you, the answer is probably quite different. So just kind of like dealing with what I believe is probably the burning question, even though there is a question that has come in already, but probably the burning question in a lot of people's minds is, how does an artist who has a show at a gallery go about getting the attention of a writer of your stature? How does that work?
Who wants to answer that, or who's that directed to?
I'll jump in for that. It works in mysterious ways, Dexter, mysterious ways. Not to be so flip, but in my case, again, I'm not reviewing as much as reporting. And so I would say a gallery show is not going to be the subject typically of what I write about. It's going to be a bigger trend, or there's going to be some news component or something at the museum level. But just in terms of, the artist profiles that I do, for example, they come out of me looking at art at galleries and museums, talking to artists about what they're looking at. Artists lead the way sometimes. And my most recent piece for the New York Times that came out last week is actually a bit of an extreme example. I did a profile of an artist, Kim Abelies, who's been working in LA for many, many years on environmental issues. And she works on pollution, but also with pollution, where she makes these stencils on different surfaces and then puts them on the rooftop of her studio and lets the smog fill in the stencil. So the smog is actually making the drawing, and she's been doing this in really, really smart, urgent work for about 30 years. That I had only vaguely heard of, and so this was a strange case where I literally stumbled across her work because she has new public sculpture up in a park where I hike. So I'm hiking, I see a public sculpture, I noticed, who's making it. I learned something about this new series of public sculptures, and that leads me to her more important, but more central work, this Smog collector series she's done. So this is, a circuitous case where then I look into the Smog collectors, and there is a major show of her work up, but it's not at MoCA, it's not at LACMA, it's not at the Getty, it's at a much smaller venue, Cal State Fullerton. And I made the drive out, and then I made the argument as hard as I could that she deserved coverage, where, there are, in my case, I feel like my history over the last 25 years of writing about art has been a history of trying to get further and further away from the market, in a way that the market pressures would have you write about Damien Hirst and Jordan Wolfson and it's kind of like a hot young thing pressure or something, that they're the artists who have the big galleries, the big museum shows, the big money, the big publicists promoting every single thing they do. And for me, it's been a kind of long journey of seeing that more clearly and trying to resist it or go beyond it. So I don't want to write about Jordan Wolfson anymore. And I'm finding that when I made that decision very consciously about 6 years ago, it made space for me to write about other kinds of art that aren't the hot, they aren't the flavor of the month. And I have not written about NFTs yet. So I'm curious what Sebastian has found in that new world for us.
Yeah. Speaking of the market, it's revolting.
And that's a good volley back to you, Sebastian, because I am curious about that piece, even though we don't have to go into painful detail about it. But I'm also curious about something that Jori mentioned about like market pressures. Like, how much autonomy do you have to decide what you want to write about in the case of just purely like covering a topic or an artist versus what you sort of are asked to do by the publications that you work with? How does that?
Yeah, look, there's for me, there's no pressure to do with the market, honestly. I mean, I've never written about Jordan Wolfson, and I think as a critic, you're just constantly feeling like you're in a battle against the market, because the market is dictating so much to the public. It catches their eyeballs with record prices, and so much of it is manipulated. And the NFT thing is a great example of that. I mean, the sale of this work by Beeple, the only reason it got $69 million, which is just an it's an absurd price, is because these cryptocurrency guys, and they're almost all guys, it seems, have a vested interest in bidding it up. And it was only cryptocurrencies guys who were bidding it up. And they're doing that because they're playing a bigger game. They want, I mean, it's a whole other story we don't need to get into, but they want to have a slice of so-called Web 3.0, and they're using artworks, digital artworks, as a kind of test case for how assets are going to work in the metaverse. I mean, it's really like that, and the art market is just a place that they can play with that whole idea. I mean, it sounds really cynical, but I think that's essentially what's going on. The pressure I have is more that,
Sebastian, doesn't the art market also affect what's in museums, though? I mean, I'm not talking about direct auction coverage at this point. I'm talking about that all the major museums have boards that are made up of collectors who have vested interest in certain artists and want to fund shows of those artists. That even what we're seeing at the museum level has a market component to it.
That's absolutely true. It really is. But I think there is this layer of people, the curators, who are an interesting layer, who play a really important role in filtering what comes through. And I think, they're not people who are paid a lot of money at all, and they're passionate, and they're looking to put on interesting shows by both contemporary artists and older artists. And they're doing it for those reasons. I take them to be almost entirely sincere. They also then have pressures from boards, you're right, to maybe favor certain artists or certain kinds of shows. But I think you can exaggerate the effect of the market on that when we're talking about important museums. But I was going to say the pressure I'm under, in terms of my coverage is it really has to have made it to a museum, or at least one of the leading commercial galleries, for it to warrant coverage, unless I can find, a really interesting angle. And I loved your story there. That was fantastic, about walking in the park and how all that came about. And that sort of thing happens to me too, but just, more rarely, to be honest. And it's a big change from what I was doing early in my career, which was doing the commercial gallery rounds, in Sydney, where there's a thriving commercial gallery scene, and just writing about artists and feeling like I played some part in helping bring younger artists and neglected older artists to the attention of a public. But it was a very local public. It was just within Sydney, within Australia. But it was exciting to sort of be part of that. And I feel now, it's much rarer that I'm doing that. I mean, I can mention Ragnar Kjartansson to my editors, and they're like, who's that? And probably the same with Jordan Wolfson or a lot of other big contemporary artists. And so even there, you're fighting a battle to say, hey, we really need to do this. So yeah, I've talked enough. Siddhartha, go ahead.
Well, I mean, to the quick answer to Dexter's question, and building on what each of the two of you has also said, is, you know, we're out there, right? I go to the galleries frequently. I see tons of art. I look at the listings. I see what's happening in the major and minor museums in the New York area and around the country, and in other countries of interest to me. Certainly, I hope we can go back to that mode of operating sometime soon. We all get millions of email publicity pitches, ranging from just ones that are bombarded at everybody in the landscape to ones that are actually very carefully thought out and addressed to us specifically by a publicist that we know and have a good relationship with, everything across that. So it all, you know, it comes out through that somewhat opaque and chaotic process, but there is a logic to it. When it comes to, you know, then it really depends on who you're writing for, and what's the audience, and what's the outlet. When I've written for some of the glossier publications and that kind of thing, they've come to me and they said, hey, we want to do a profile about this person. Do you want to do it? And I'm like, okay, yeah, I will do that. I wonder, you know what? That's not really my thing. You should have somebody else. With the Times, we're lucky, right? For those of us who write for the Times, we're lucky because it's a really large team. There's the staff people, there's the frequent freelancers like us, there's the less frequent freelancers. You don't have to cover everything. It's a big world, but there's a lot of people who potentially can touch on it. And then you can have some specialties. I'm not going to all of the galleries. I'm not checking out all the artists of every kind. I'm interested in artists who are engaging with race, class, gender, and empire. Obviously, that's still a lot of that's much of the field. But I'm interested in. I'm not really following closely the contemporary art scene in some regions of the world, and I am following it pretty closely in some other regions of the world. That's fine. You know, it's a big world, and I am interested in what's happening in artist-run spaces, certain kinds of independent spaces, and I do try to keep an eye on what's happening in the smaller cities in the region. I'm always interested in what's happening in Newark and New Haven. You know, like to give props to people in the suburbs trying to do some good work that are very much part of our readership base, but we don't necessarily honor their institutions and so forth. So it's all kind of chaotic, but I think that over the years we form our methodologies. And let me just echo one other thing. What Sebastian was saying about the curators is very important. I mean, I do realize I do talk to a ton of curators. You become friends with a lot of curators, and it's just organic. At a certain point, you just know who in the field you're in touch with, and you get to learn to see with them and through them. And then also, I do use Instagram, definitely.
Well, you said a lot. So there are a few things I want to touch on, and also something you said, Sebastian. So, you know, this idea of like cynicism when it comes to, let's use like NFTs, for example. I'm always down for a healthy dose of cynicism, because I think that whenever I examine something really, really closely, I see like the underpinnings of how it actually works. I go, yeah, well, I guess, you know, you could have assumed that. You know, money has a way of influencing so many things that happen, particularly, you know, in business, in the art world. But, you know, it also made me think about a feeling I had years ago reading a lot of the smaller publications that, you know, publish every day. No need to name names, but, you know, that are covering the art world. It seemed like for a while, all I was reading was someone's interpretation of a press release, as opposed to any sort of like thought out, you know, critique or even review. And I'm wondering, at this point, do you see sort of like more interest in actual like meaty writing as it relates to contemporary art scene? as opposed to these sort of like, because the internet has had a way of making everyone a writer, quote unquote, a writer. And I always say, it's anyone can write, but only certain people can write really, really well. But what's your feeling about that in terms of being able to be critical? Maybe this is more directed to you, Sebastian, because you're the one of the three folks here who said, I am in fact, a critic, an art critic. Do you cover things when you don't have anything good to say? I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to be clear, I think all three of us, bring a real critical intelligence to what we're doing, and it manifests itself, in different ways in our choices, in the way we write about things, and but and it's funny. I mean, I think the Washington Post and a lot of other publications have less and less interest in reviews. I mean, we have to almost fight to sort of keep reviews going, and the reason is that they don't feel that those pieces get the same kind of traction in terms of readership. I think they do and can, and it's partly that they don't allow them to in terms of where they place them on the page. But yeah, I think critical voices are really important. And yeah, I do write negative things about pieces, less and less than over the years, I've got to say. And there are different reasons for that. One is that there's just so much stuff competing for attention. Why pick out bad stuff? But often there's an interesting opportunity to say something about an artist who is maybe inflated, whose reputation you feel is inflated, and it might be the result of kind of market type forces and those other things that we might feel cynical about. So have a go get in there and say what you really think, and don't sit on the fence about it. People are reading you. You're paid to have an opinion. The opinion that you have might not be right. It might not be the most interesting thing about the piece of writing, but if that's your job in that case to be a critic, then that's the one obligation you have, to offer an opinion, and then you have to argue it out. So you're putting yourself on the line there. But when you're writing a piece of reportage, and when you're doing that, you're putting yourself on the line equally, or maybe even more. And people don't often realize that you have to get everything right. You have to get your sources right. You have to get your facts right. It's a lot of work. You've got to structure a story in a way that kind of you don't need to think about so much when you're just writing a review. So there's a lot to it, and it's a real art form to write those kinds of pieces. And I know that because when I do them, I struggle, and I really think, wow, that people who are doing this every day and every week, it's incredibly difficult. People don't realize how difficult it is.
You're muted.
One of the questions that came in was something you said, Sid Arthur. You mentioned that the field of art writing is immiserated. I think that's the word you used. Could you expand on that? And I'd also like to hear if the other panelists agree.
Well, I mean, it's journalism in general, right? I mean, it's the scarcity. I mean, it's the fact that the outlets that could invest in arts coverage are not investing in arts coverage, and a few are maintaining their level of investment in arts coverage. I think the Times is maintaining its level, which I appreciate that, because it is overall good. A lot of the regional papers have gotten rid of arts coverage, or killed, or largely killed it off. The alt weeklies are dead pretty much completely. Really, really, really important segment of the field that is just gone, or eviscerated. A major segment for bringing up new voices, bringing up new skills, bringing up different communities of writers, etc. Just gone. And just like every other industry, there's a few posh players at the top, and then there's a lot of people struggling, which is like the blogs and this and that. Then there's the trade press, right, which plays its role, the ARTnets and ARTnews and so on. I mean, it's all, but all of it plays a part. But people aren't investing in arts and culture coverage, and the new models haven't come. All these new models, and the for-profit models, and the ProPublicas and the Marshall projects and so on. Yeah, it's coming, and investigative journalism, it's coming in certain fields that we haven't found that here. So the result is it is immiserated. We're very badly paid. And there's not many of us who are who are given the opportunity to write in places where we have the right infrastructure, the high quality editors and the good photographers and the good everything to really get our stuff out there and help us do the best work we possibly can. And so the result is, yeah, among many other things, we're dealing with an enormous creative field, and there's just not that many of us who are doing it in a visible or sustainable way, which is another reason for what Sebastian was saying of like, you know, you don't want to spend a lot of time writing about stuff that you don't like, because there's so much that really warrants writing about that you really want to make sure is out there in the culture. And then
I think that's such an important point you were making, though, is just how small the number of art publications is and the number of art writers, how small that number is in this bigger ecosystem, because you could say it's the golden age for art making in a way, in terms of how many artists are making a living off of their art right now, how many gallerists. I mean, I remember when Chelsea first started, you know, there were only 4 galleries in Chelsea, and I was an editor at Art+Auction at the time, and we decided to run a new story on this new Chelsea thing. And we had a little map with the 4 galleries, right? At the time, I had this distinct feeling that every gallery that was opening was a way for someone to spend money, that they weren't making money. They'd already made their money elsewhere, and they were spending money by opening a gallery, spending family money, spending trust fund money, spending their husband's money, their wife's money, whatever. And I feel that's less and less, that there are a lot of people I know, they might not, you know, they're not in it for the money, but they're able to make a living and contribute and keep their gallery alive. I mean, we saw remarkably few closures of galleries in LA during the pandemic. You know, very few. We've seen some open. So when you look at the larger ecosystem and how well it's doing, and I know art schools are struggling in different ways, but there's still so many of them, then it does seem almost criminal that there are so few outlets for writing about art. On the other hand, I'm a little suspicious as to whether there was this golden age of art writing. I do know that when I started, there were more art magazines, and they paid better, and they had bigger staffs, and you had more time to think about things. But I don't know if it was when was the golden age of art journalism? If right now is such a struggle, and it is in terms of wage equity and all of the things you were talking about. I'm not sure it was ever all that robust, or if it wasn't, people writing about art. How many people do we know who were writing about art when they, their main line of business, as it were, was poetry or what have you in the 20th century? Or so I'm kind of mixed. I mean, personally, I could say that on the one hand, I've been really fortunate that I've been able to stay in this field and work in this field for 25, 30 years. On the other hand, I did lose a staff job at the LA Times because they were downsizing and just, had to eliminate their art reporter position when they kept at least 10 people on staff covering film and TV as reporters. So I feel like I've seen both. I don't think it's all gloom and doom, considering the number of outlets, that exist, at least online these days.
What were you going to add something to that, Sebastian?
No, I was just going to say that that was criminal what happened to you there, and I mean,
best thing that ever happened to me. So
well, there you go. Well, that's great. Yeah. But I mean, to your point earlier about LA and the art scene there, the idea that that people had in the past, and you said this too, Dexter, that it didn't warrant proper coverage is just ridiculous. I mean, it was ridiculous then, and of course it's even more ridiculous now. It's such a dynamic and incredibly energetic scene, and the idea that the LA Times kind of, given everything, I mean, you played a really big role in that. So the idea that, yeah, it was just crazy. But you've you know, like, you've made great things happen from that. So that's great. But it's,
and they've gone back to the, they have an art reporter on staff again. So they have Carolina, who's doing an amazing job. So, if we got any attention at the time on my way out, it was to say this paper needs an art reporter, and they do have one. So,
but I think that wider point is, go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think there's a newspaper crisis that, I think affects all of us.
Yes.
That
let's talk about that. So, like, switching gears a bit. So, assuming someone joining us today is thinking about pursuing a career as a writer, as a critic. I mean, what are the headwinds? What are they facing? What is the next? I mean, no one here can predict the future, but what does the next 10 years look like in your field, in your opinion?
I can
start with you. Yeah, please.
Sure. Yes, okay, I'll just be brief, Siddhartha, and then you go ahead. But I mean, the great thing, I mean, rather than the headwinds, we can talk about that, but be aware that it's I mean, if you can make it work, it's one of those interesting fields of work. I mean, it's just so endlessly fascinating. And some people say, oh, you write about art? You mean just visual art, sort of thing, as if that were a small field. I mean, working at the Art newspaper way back then taught me how wide the field of art is. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, and it touches on every aspect of life. And there is more happening in art now than ever before. There are more museums, more people go to museums, there are more galleries, there are more artists, as you say, making a living. And succeeding, and so it's endlessly rich. The headwinds are, they're to do with the business models. If we're talking about coverage by what used to be called newspapers, media companies, whatever you want to call them, the headwinds are that the business models collapsed. Simple as that, right? So local newspapers just began to die, and journalism generally suffered. It's not just art writing. And I think 40% of journalists over the last 10 years or something have lost their jobs. Maybe it's 25%. It's some huge figure. So, it's some of the big players like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, have succeeded by A, getting rich owners to come in, and B, by being national, using their brand recognition to be national and international, and switching to a subscriber model, because the advertising model that they were working on is just so competitive, thanks to all the big tech companies and everything moving online. So that's why there are fewer positions available. But I have I don't know. I feel like things are going to keep changing over the next 10 years, and that maybe it's just stupid optimism, but I feel like, because the appetite for art writing, I sincerely believe, is so great, that things might improve there. But I'm not going to offer any prescriptions there, because I'll probably be wrong. What do you think?
I was just going to say, do you think there's a market for art writing in the metaverse? Is that what?
That's a great question.
Where are we heading? But
I'm not convinced about
I'm throwing out nonsense
taking
bullshit
over everything.
But it's because it's hard. It's hard to predict. If we could predict it, we could do it, right? If we could come up with a business model that would keep original content and reporting alive. I mean, I'm sure you guys have had the experience as well of just seeing your articles replayed endlessly in a way that shows, how little original reporting gets done out there. But Dexter, you were about to say something.
Well, I wanted to offer Siddhartha an opportunity to chime in on that as well. I mean, thinking about the field over the next decade, just like what do you see? Like someone's saying, I'm interested in becoming a writer in the arts. What do you think I'm to look forward to, or what am I up against?
No, I mean, I would say do it. I would say try it. I mean, there's a lot of young talent. There's a lot of young talent there, and and people who are, becoming good writers, good critics, good thinkers about art and culture, who could benefit from really being kind of like trained up, raised up in journalism and editing and, you know, all of that. And a lot of people who are kind of going into journalism who would benefit from being able to do culture journalism, including art journalism and books journalism and theater journalism and all of that, and maybe aren't finding as many windows to do that as other kinds of journalism. But I mean, the talent is there, the desire is there, and so it does come back to the business model. And at that point, you just have to see what the landscape looks like and get a sense of the business model and see if and hustle, you know, figure out how you're going to configure your hustle in order to find a path. But I think I don't have any predictions about the next 10 years for, you know, the art writing niche, but I do think that the arts world, art and art making and arts communities are going to keep on opening new paths, opening new windows. You know, it's what art is doing, what culture does is it opens up, it expands civic possibility, right? And so when the political discourse, the policy discourse, the economics discourse are reductive of civic possibility, which has been the case basically since 1980 in the world, the culture is where it spills out, and that's where you find civic possibility. And Greg, one thing that Greg Tate pointed out among the quadrillion brilliant things he pointed out with extraordinary verve and style and just perfection over the course of his career. But one thing he was thinking about is how, in his view, in the 90s, or, you know, in the course of the last generation and a half, something that was happening in music, particularly in black music and black music's, you know, it was jazz and hip hop and so on that were really proposing new ways of thinking about the world. And an argument that he made is that as those fields became niche or corporatized or co-opted and so on, and at the same time in the 90s, the visual art world really kind of started blowing up, and the diversification that my colleagues were just talking about really happened, and things popped up all over the world, and artist run things and regional art and everything. Greg pointed out that he thought that the mantle had passed for really pointing the way forward and really imagining new ways of being in the world, as you know, humanly and so on, had moved, in his view, from music as the vanguard of that to contemporary art as the vanguard of that. You know, I think it's a seductive argument. I tend to agree, but in any case, you could also say that, well, it's the culture fields in general that are doing that. I think the fact that we do the work that we do means that we all kind of think that, like, visual art, broadly put, really is particularly promising. But, you know, so I think that in the next 10 years, we're going to keep on thinking much more productively through culture making and art making than through public policy and you know, all this other stuff. And we're going to think more productively about economics and the environment and all of that through culture than we are through the official channels. And so for those of us who write about it, what our work will look like will be a function of our ability to get with that, to follow along, and to be part of that thinking. And so I don't know what it means in terms of what the jobs are going to look like, or what the rates of pay are going to look like, and so on. But I do think that in terms of the real thing, which is like, what is it doing for the world, and what is it doing for society and for ideas, it's going to be super interesting.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I'm curious to know if there are any projects that the three of you are working on that you can talk about, things you're excited about. Maybe they're with the publications that we've already mentioned, or maybe it's a book or something else that you're doing that you'd be able to share. I'm just curious to know, like, what are you getting up in the morning excited about? I'll start with you, Jori.
I don't know how much I can say about this, but right now I'm working on I had the kind of the dream situation where my editor at W Magazine asked me, what am I looking at? What do I want to write about? And I picked something that I'm looking at that cuts across a bunch of painters in LA and in New York and beyond. But I'm in it. I'm like in the weeds right now, doing the studio visits and Zoom studio visits, and you'll have to wait a couple months to see what I do with it. But yeah, maybe somebody else is further along in their project they can talk about.
Thanks for sharing that. Anyway, how about you, Sebastian?
That sounds really interesting, Jori. I mean, yeah, I'm a little further on. I'm sort of past my deadline and the thing I'm working on. It's just a book about. I'm being told my internet connection's unstable here, but hopefully you can still hear me. It's a book about Morisot and Edouard Manet. You mentioned it before. Thanks, Dexter. But just living through this period, 1870-71, which I think people sort of half know about, but maybe not that much, where Paris was besieged after the French lost a war to Prussia, which became Germany at that point. And Manet and Morisot were both living inside Paris, and it was a really traumatic experience. It was the coldest winter in living memory. Everyone was reduced to eating first, horses, and then rats and pigeons, and eventually, the zoo animals. I mean, it was a really extreme situation, and it was really a kind of turning point in the life and the career of Berthe Morisot, who's probably the best known, along with Mary Cassatt, I guess, the best known female impressionist, but I think one of the greatest as well. And it was going through that experience. This is my hypothesis anyway, that sort of made her, commit herself to pursuing a career as a professional artist, with a new sort of resolution that she hadn't had before. So I'm excited writing about that. It was weird, sort of writing about the siege during the sort of the lockdown, I guess, last year, because there were all sorts of weird parallels and a kind of political explosiveness that came out of it, or a political consciousness that I think we all experienced here as well. So I mean, I didn't want to force the parallels, but it was just a really interesting time. So that's what I'm working on, and hopefully I'm getting near the end of it.
And Siddhartha, I'd love to hear from you as well.
For me, well, in the immediate, I mean, as a freelancer, I'm always just looking at like what's the immediate thing that's on the plate right now, and then we'll deal with everything else afterwards. But immediately, I'm working on a feature, a reported feature that is super interesting. What will I say about it indirectly? It is it's about an artist who's taking a really major risk. Really an artist who set themselves a high degree of difficulty, and it's a fairly well-known artist, and so that in a way amplifies the risk. And so I've been privy to what they're doing, and I'm going to try to write about it. So that's what I'm doing right now. Medium lead, there's things maybe starting to take shape around what's on the calendar for late winter, early spring. You start to kind of concoct what some of the features are like. I'm sure like Jori is probably just like me in ongoing conversations with the one editor that we share, the great and glorious character of an editor that we share. I think we share several editors also, because I've written for W as well. So that's just kind of the weave of the thing. I don't have a book. I don't have a book project. I kind of wish I did, sort of, but haven't really been able to formulate it just yet. And then I have a lot of projects, specific projects, but also just kind of relations, professional and creative relations with people in Africa, in West Africa in particular, and also in Southern Africa. And when the pandemic hit, when everything shut down in March of 2020, I was supposed to spend all of May and part of June in Senegal, There was a whole schedule of things that I was going to do. And so my work with people on the continent, colleagues on the continent, artists, curators, institutions, writers, training writers, everything. My work on the continent has just been cut. We're just kind of communicating by this method, and it's getting real tired. It's getting real tired. So I'm looking forward to. I'm really looking forward to rebuilding that bridge and being able to cross it.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing that. I mean, and you actually, what you just said reminded me of a question I wanted to ask the group, and that's sort of like thinking about art in other places than the usual places that people think about when they think about art scenes. But when you were describing your book, Sebastian, and how the coldest winter on record, I physically felt cold when you were describing what people had to resort to in terms of eating or what have you. But in terms of looking at the brighter days ahead, we're past the lockdown period, we're past the pandemic, and where do you enjoy going to see art? What are the places that if you could just travel right now and just immerse yourself in the art scene, what's that city for you?
I want to go. I'm going to Madrid. I'm going to the Prado. I think from LA too, because we have such a lively contemporary scene. But it's not the Met and it's not the Frick, and so I'm feeling like an old master's craving these days.
You have the Getty and the Norton Simon, and I mean, there's not like they've got more offerings in that area than most places. But I hear you totally.
But, I want the Goya. I want to see Goya.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'd love to get to Madrid. Gosh, yeah.
I'm glad to have been moving around in the U.S. again in recent weeks, which has been good. I've been in New Orleans, I've been in Atlanta, I've been in Chicago, I've been in LA. That's great to be back on the move a little bit. But me, Dakar, Abidjan, Accra, Kinshasa, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Lubumbashi, Nairobi. That's where it's at for me.
Wow, that's that's quite the itinerary.
Sounds amazing. Yeah.
No, I really appreciate all of your generosity today in terms of sharing all of your insights there. We do have a little bit more time, and I just wanted to kind of like touch on something that you mentioned earlier, Sebastian, just regarding technology and how it fits into all of this. I mean, the metaverse, it's one of those things that kind of keeps coming up. I think it's come up in every single conversation I've had with everyone in the past, like few weeks or so. I mean, for each of you, there's so much being said about this other space, this other world, this other opportunity that we might have as people who work in the arts. I mean, any opinions on that? I mean, you said you're not convinced, Sebastian, that it's gonna, sort of do all the things it's purported to. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I'm terrible at predicting the future, and but it's a really interesting space right now, and it's no wonder everyone's talking about it. I think there's a lot of great things that will come out of it. When I was sounding cynical about NFTs before, I mean, the reality is that they're going to produce a lot of opportunities. They already are for a lot of artists, especially working in the digital field. And that's really interesting. And it's a way, really, an NFT is a financial tool. It's creating this notional scarcity, and that means once you've got scarcity, you can commodify something. The problem is you also need demand. And so what we're seeing now is this kind of paradox of the creation of scarcity, but in fact, in reality, a deluge of NFTs, because they're so easy and quick to create, and you can do it from almost anything. So we're going to see a collapse of that in some sense. But, creative, brilliant people are always going to be there working in any new sort of field. And this digital art has been around for a long time, since the invention of computers. So, this is really just bringing more attention to them. NFTs are not a new medium like photography was, or, video art, or going back, oil painting. I mean, it's not like that. It's just a financial tool, really. But it does allow more attention to be paid to some of these digital artists. And there are some really interesting ones out there. So I met a few of them down in Miami, and I saw some really fascinating work. And I saw a lot to make me even more cynical about the wider field, because I do feel like it's being manipulated by these cryptocurrency guys in ways that, yeah. Don't ask me to give predictions about the metaverse. So that's a bigger thing. And I'll just say that, attempts have been made. It's this interesting tension between this kind of almost utopian sort of libertarian sort of notion that we can avoid states and governments and so on by creating this currency that's available to all, and it's a public ledger and all this kind of stuff. And the reality that this field is being sort of engineered by entrepreneurs who are trying to make money, and there's been a big angle for it for criminals and tax avoiders as well. So it's a really complex area, but it is a new technology and a new thing that is going to change things. But I just don't think it's going to be the revolution that people say, because there've been earlier attempts to do this, and Web3 is just a kind of buzzword to try and revive that in a way. They've failed in the past, and I think they probably will again, but I don't know.
Jori and Siddhartha, any thoughts on that?
I'm just observing. I'm open to the possibilities. If somebody whom I really respect creatively or intellectually, or just that I like their hunches, I feel that if somebody who really is like a thinker and a seeker, and there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of those that we deal with, points in an unusual direction that I didn't expect, I'm going to see, well, what is it that drew them? Like, what are they seeing? Like, that's actually interesting. And that direction could be in NFT and crypto and or it could be in some totally unexpected kind of public intervention, or it could be anything, right? So we're fortunate to know and to be in a world full of experimenters, and so we'll just watch the experiments.
Yeah, but I think Sebastian's point that this pretends to be a great democratic platform in a way, and then it's being engineered by these Silicon Valley bros or something like it. You look at gender equity issues already, and they're appalling. I mean, the number of women using NFT, number of female artists who are developing NFTs compared to male artists is dismal. So, and you wonder
some of the most interesting are women, though. Sorry.
What was that?
I was just, you're absolutely right about that. I was just going to say that some of the most interesting ones, though, are women. And, Sarah Meyerhouse is one, and she's so articulate about it. And her, I think it was her sort of conceptual project, Bitcoin, it was called, really kind of predicted NFTs before they came along. And
you hope it's
you've
not
got some others. But yeah, I went to an...
What I'm hoping at this stage is that it's not self-fulfilling, that it's not colonized in a kind of dude bro way that makes women disinterested in it, and therefore, and then it perpetuates and it becomes this territory that really, how is feminism going to play out in this new world? And I think that's something I'm watching.
Yeah, I am as well. I have another question in that vein, but we've come to the end here. I just want to reiterate how grateful we are to have the three of you join us today. We're coming to the close of quite the year, and I just want to take a moment to just not only thank you all, but wish you all a fantastic 2022. I think we could all use a fantastic 2022.
I'll take it. Thank you, Dexter.
And if there are any final thoughts you'd like to share before we close today's conversation.
Just a big thank you to you guys. Thanks to the people who are listening. Thank you so much for listening to us, and Dexter for hosting and your great questions. Thanks so much.
And thanks to all of you. We don't get these collegial moments necessarily all that much, even in the best of times, because we're writers and we tend to be solitary. So it's nice to be together and exchange.
Awesome.
Agreed. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I wish you all, wherever your time zone is, I wish you all a great day ahead. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Good night. Good afternoon. Good
Thank you.
morning, Dexter.
Good morning, Dexter. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.